Hello everyone, it's me, Spooky Spader, your storytime companion. And I just wanted to say, thanks. We hit 200 subscribers the other week, and I was absolutely floored. We went from 28 subscribers to 210 in like 2 weeks. That was crazy. I'd never expected that to happen. I did not expect to even get this far. So I just wanted to say, thanks. Thanks for all the subscribes, and thanks for all the likes and all your heartfelt comments. So you guys seem to like what I do, I guess. So I've decided I'm going to start giving you a little bit more every now and again. So we're gonna have weekly updates. We're gonna have weekly episodes, especially when it comes to the Kin series. The Kin series is what a lot of y'all have been asking for, and I just wanted to let you know it's coming back. We're gonna have new episodes of the Kin series every week now. Every Friday at 7 o'clock, we're gonna have the Kin series, and then on Saturdays it'll be a new story. I may or may not throw something in the middle of the week. Maybe just a hump day horror, if you will. Just something to keep the week going. So yeah, I just wanted to give you a brief couple of announcements and thank you. So with all that out of the way, it's story time. Thinking outside the box. We've all been asked to do this at one point or another. In most cases, the request was made by a teacher. Perhaps a hip, cool, how do you do, fellow kids kind of teacher, who wants you to think creatively, but only if your creative thinking aligns with whatever slightly unorthodox method he's trying to teach. But of course, you just want the lesson to end, so you make half-hearted guesses. And when he shoots those down, you stare at him blank-faced, unchallenged and uninterested, until he reverts to the original, proper lesson plan, forsaking his attempt to teach you a concept or method that wasn't any better than the original way, just different from it. Outside-of-the-box thinking generally isn't any better than in-the-box thinking, at least for me. I've stood outside the box, I've scaled its surfaces, measured its dimensions, and I gotta say, the exterior isn't all that great. Its surfaces aren't especially conducive to higher thought. More abstract thought, maybe, but who's to say abstraction is inherently superior? I carried this belief in regards to the methodology of thought for 23 years, right up until the incident with the gunman. And, of course, my observation of the man that this tale is ultimately about. A good example of out-of-the-box thinking being nothing more than a repackaging of stupid thinking is the incident that landed me in the hospital with 2 gunshot wounds to the thigh and stomach. A couple of surgeries and a small fortune in prescriptions later, I'm mostly fine. I sometimes, more often than not actually, walk with a limp, and a soft tap to the gut will make me wince. But otherwise, I can climb stairs and pass gas with the best of them. How I received those gunshot wounds is more interesting than how I've been since receiving them, so I'll move on to that. Only a true outside-of-the-box thinker, a true creatively minded imbecile would think to rob a video store. A dying video store. A video store that still sold copies of RoboCop and Terminator on VHS. A video store that had survived the near-complete extinction of its kind by reducing all its prices by truly embarrassing degrees, by being operated by a single employee, its sole owner, and by the frequent patronage of people like me, people who like physical media, who enjoy buying physical media, and who may or may not have large amounts of free time due to a social life devoid of socializing. People who spend their abundant amount of free time watching movies that no one has discussed with any real conversational substance for about 2 decades. So when I was standing in an aisle before the dusty cases of the insert your pre-2000s creature of choice, browsing for something to watch and obsessively analyze over the weekend, I was fairly surprised when the entrance bell rang and a man wielding a fearsome-looking shotgun entered the store. He wore a black leather jacket, jeans that looked as old as the movies I'd been standing by, and a ski mask that might have been stolen from a 90s heist prop movie bin. The gun, however, looked new, as if prior to arriving at the decision to rob a movie store, he'd somehow lifted a Remington from a gun shop. The store owner, a man in his 50s who moved and reacted like a man in his 70s, turned to the newly arrived thief and sighed. I felt that sigh. I echoed it in my own way. It was a sigh that said, as if life wasn't already shit enough. I was fonder of the store than pretty much anything else in my life, so I had about as much stake in its existence than the owner who relied upon its meager business for putting food on the table. I don't know what you'd call it. The shakedown, the stick-up. Let's just call it a robbery, even though nothing was actually stolen. The robber, or gunman, waved the shotgun around, demanding money in a voice that sounded both impatient and bored. Agitated by the inconvenience that robbing someone imposed upon his ordinarily straightforward lifestyle, maybe. The owner went through the responsive motion slowly, lethargically, as if half hoping to receive a chest full of buckshot just to be free from renting out movies to the same handful of people day after day after day. I watched, unheeded by the gunman and forgotten by the store owner, while still cradling movie cases in my arms. I'd never witnessed a moment of serious crime before, so no thoughts of heroism or even self-preservation even came to mind. I was merely captivated by the awe of it. I would eventually be terrified, rendered speechless by the horror of an unexplainable, barely comprehended sight. But in that initial moment, I was simply shocked. When the few dollars that had been in the register were placed upon the counter, and both men in this unfortunate situation had physically expressed their dissatisfaction with their transaction, the robber began his rounds, moving through the store looking for anyone who might have wallets full of money, or anything to add to his pathetic haul from the register. I didn't catch on to this in time, however, being shocked by the admittedly uninteresting first phase of thievery. So I didn't move, and the robber soon became aware of my presence and demanded that I empty my pockets. I gave him what I had, and I saw that disappointed grimace up close. If I had been born with a slightly thicker spine or balls that were a bit heavier, I might have said something along the lines of, "If I had money, why would I be shopping here?" But I kept my mouth shut and obeyed his order, a half-articulated grunt really, to stay in the aisle while he continued patrolling the others. The sun shone directly into the store, not inhibited by storefront signs or stickers. The movies, as a result, were faded, making them look even older than they already were. My shadow was laid upon the floor and shelves, and even it looked bored by the events. While waiting for the robber to stalk through the aisles, I caught a glimpse of the store owner dispassionately eating a candy bar, as if his body had just autonomously decided to provide itself with some kind of sustenance without bothering to consult his mind. I note this because it was at this exact moment that another person entered the store. The robber. That outside-the-box intellectual hadn't thought to lock the door in the meantime, through criminal forgetfulness or criminal confidence. The newcomer, a man who looked much too lively to be in a store like this, walked up to the counter and I actually saw the store owner's mind boot back up. His chewing slowed, his eyes flickered, and he even shook away the webs of apathy that had enmeshed his thoughts. They had a brief exchange that I could not hear, but from the nature of the man's body language, erect though relaxed, like a suburban dad walking into a home improvement store, I guessed that the store owner hadn't informed the man of the robbery in progress. The man walked away from the counter, and when his back was turned, the store owner glanced at me and gave me the most wicked, sadistically mischievous grins I'd ever seen. I realized then that I had greatly underestimated the store owner's boredom. He was a man who dealt in fiction, in the fantastical, in the morbid, in the purely speculative. Reality was unbearingly boring to him. Even then, in the midst of a situation most people dread to ever experience, he was having a boring time. So he must have thought, why not spice things up a bit? Add a wild card. Maybe something interesting will happen. Things certainly did get interesting, and then they became terrifying, and as you already know, agonizing, for me at least. The man walked out of my sight, and some inner ethical impetus drove me to follow him. Thankfully, the robber was sweeping through the aisles on the opposite side of the store, and the newcomer had gone to an aisle not far from mine. I rounded the corner to find him standing in front of the store's middling fantasy collection. Not that there's many good fantasy movies, with his hands in the pockets of his navy blue windbreaker. He seemed pleasantly content with the selection, eyeing them all with a wonder that I mentally noted but didn't consciously think over at the time. Looking back, it makes sense for him to have been amused by them. There was no music playing in the store. Might have felt inappropriately upbeat, so I had to whisper extremely low. Still, the man heard me and nodded along in understanding of my words. He smiled, thanked me with a casualness and audibility that almost made me respond by screaming at him, then went back to browsing the fantasy flicks. The robber was, eventually, mindful of something. He'd noticed my absence from my designated spot. I heard him call out a, "Hey!" which I knew to be directed at me since there wasn't anyone else to, "Hey!" at. Besides the owner, who wouldn't have deviated from his NPC-like station at the register. Before I could say or do anything to excuse my absence, the robber entered the aisle, shotgun poised chest level towards me. My hands went up, and the movies I'd been cradling, that I for some reason hadn't put back, fell to the floor, clattering loudly. In the following silence, I heard the store owner huff his caveman-like announcement that if I survived the ordeal, I'd be paying for the movies. The robber, in stereotypical bad guy fashion, motioned with the gun for me to step aside. I did so, revealing the still browsing patron, hands still comfortably resting in his pockets. The robber looked at me incredulously, and I returned the expression. Neither of us could believe the casualness of this guy, the amusement on his face. Finally, after allowing for as much time as any decent thug would, the robber discharged the shotgun into the shelves. The sound of the blast was interesting. I'd heard thousands of gunshots, real and simulated, conveyed through the speakers of my computer, modulated precisely to the director's/editor's tastes. But none of them, not a single one, had accurately, faithfully attested to or recreated the utterly horrible, physically destabilizing effect of hearing one in person, 2 feet away, without any sort of hearing protection or warning. I hadn't actually expected this robber to use the weapon. The idea wasn't something my brain, accustomed to and tantalized by violence, had ever truly considered. We board planes anticipating cramped seats and crying children, not collisions with mountain ranges or destruction by tempestuous weather, even though we're aware of the possibilities. As if a switch had been turned off, a cord cut, my body dropped to the ground. I hadn't been shot yet, but the concussive force of the blast, the shock of the discharge, immediately reset my ultra-domestic mind. The explosion of debris didn't bother me, even as shards of plastic and wood sliced past my face and chest. I stirred, I crawled, I clutched, and spat, desperately trying to reorient myself and rid my body of the sudden delirium. The violence of the moment segued into screams, not all of which were mine. Voices spoke above me, one very terribly urgent, the other oddly calm, almost placating. The urgent one was familiar, though at the time I couldn't tell why, so I latched onto that one. I clumsily climbed up the shelves as if drugged, lurching towards the voice which I had dimly recognized and which had sounded on the verge of insane panic. My efforts were rewarded with a sensation of flight. Maybe not flight in the sense of soaring, but in the sense of being bodily carried from one point in space to another, through means unnatural to me. My flight was short-lived, and I soon found myself staring at the ceiling, with the bizarre sensation of fingers or points of some kind pressing against at least 2 spots of my body, almost like acupuncture. The sensation intensified, focused on those 2 points until they became the epicenters of 2 greater sites of impact. Then, what had been combined sensations of warmth and pressure suddenly became locations of mind-unraveling agony. And I at last realized I had been shot. My ear still rang, and my vision was still frustratingly blurred. So the second blast hadn't altered my perception much more. The force of it, imperceptible at the time of the impact, reared itself in the heat and pressure and pain afterwards, and my body's delayed reaction manifested consummately, excruciatingly. If you want to know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a, thankfully non-fatal, shotgun blast, I suggest finding an answer to a more worthwhile inquiry. It is not something you can shrug off, or grit through, or cry out. There aren't any safety achievable parallel sensations. I wasn't even shot at directly. The gunman hadn't meant to shoot me, and I luckily had been far enough away from the actual target to merely be brushed aside by the volley. And yet it is by far the most unpleasant sensation I have ever experienced. I was given a crash course in how hilariously unprepared the human body is for events of physical trauma. So lying there, gazing up at the ceiling as my insides felt like they were liquefying, and my lungs fought against some indomitable nothing to suck in air, I heard more interesting things through the tinnitus-inducing ringing. The voice, which had been on the verge of panicking, was now panicking. The person from whom it issued cried out awfully, which I found odd since I had finally connected the voice with the gunman. This long-sustained cry was suddenly cut short and replaced by a sound that was a mix of a tree branch being snapped and a great wet heap of something falling upon the dense carpeting. As my agony deepened, my disorientation lessened, and I managed to tilt my head up, an effort that felt Herculean given the pain, and looked ahead of me. What I saw somewhat lessened my body-spanning pain, as my brain was suddenly tasked with interpreting the bizarre visual imagery, temporarily placing the pain on a cognitive back burner. It was a psychologically taxing process, trying to make sense of the ultra-violent scene. I saw what I knew to be the gunman, but positioned, displayed, in a way that I hadn't ever seen a man displayed before. He was separated from himself, torn, with his insides dangling loosely, gruesomely, right down to the floor. The steaming heap of entrails had been the wet sound I had heard earlier. The breaking of the man's skeletal structure had been the branch-like sound. The 2 halves of the man's body were connected solely through the slimy tangle of innards. Everything else had been savagely separated. Holding both halves, as if posing with two recently caught fish before a camera, was the man who had been fascinated with the fantasy films. His windbreaker had been splattered with blood, and his shoes covered in gore. His face, however, was clean, as if protected by some sort of waterproof sheen. His face still held a look of amusement, which I found even more unsettling than the sundered man his hands held. The shotgun lay beneath the hovering halves, a loose strand of intestine draped over it. The carpet was covered in shards of movie cases and media they contained, where it wasn't covered by the remains of the man. I took all this in, this great gruesome scene, in a matter of seconds, then began screaming insanely, the only action my mind could think to do in response to the grisliness. Forgetting that I had just been shot, I crawled backwards, intuiting that the gunman's death, the manner of his death, had changed circumstances, and not for my benefit. You see, after arriving at the decision to command my lungs and vocal cords to muster up a scream, my mind hastily conjured another, slightly more coherent thought, a supposition, really, and it was this: that the man, who was plainly not human, would now murder me, since I had witnessed an exhibition of his inhuman capabilities. It was, after all, how many similar, albeit fictional, circumstances had played out in the movies and shows I often rented from the store. This man's almost obnoxiously ordinary attire was a clear indication that he desired to uphold an appearance of normalcy. Ripping apart a man in a video store is the antithesis of that intention, so to assure that this act would not be reported and his normalcy publicly discontinued, he would have to rip apart another man. Me. I hadn't thought to plead with him. It wasn't out of the belief that to do so would be futile. I was just stupidly, irreconcilably terrified. The man, seeing me inching away, dropped the two halves of the gunman and walked towards me. The casualness of his stride, the nonchalance of his expression, inspired the blackest, deepest horror within me. I froze, a condemned deer in the executing headlights, unable to do anything but breathlessly gawk at the approaching entity, clearly not a man. He stood over me, blood streaking down his windbreaker, and extended a hand. I recoiled physically and spiritually, expecting it to close around my throat, lift me up, and longitudinally bisect me like a piece of paper. But the man did not reach closer than just a few inches before my face, and the fingers remained relaxed, non-threatening. Finally understanding the intended gesture, but still horrified by what might follow it, I tentatively extended my own hand. The two members met, with the higher former around the lower. Gently, courteously, the man lifted me to my feet, mindful of the trauma that had been dealt to my body. He gave me a warm smile, and I don't just mean figuratively. There was a physical, palpable warmth that emanated from the expression, a warmth whose radiance was oddly restorative. I felt the pain of my wounds lessened. The wounds themselves did not miraculously heal. I was given the ability, imparted the fortitude, to handle them with something that approached comfort. Without consciously commanding my lips to, I found myself thanking the stranger. He nodded, turned away, but stopped, and I first thought it was to sidestep the mess he had made of the other man. But he instead turned back to me and said, "These aren't very accurate," while gesturing broadly toward the scattered remains of the fantasy films. Stupidly allowing my curiosity to get the better of me, I asked what he meant by that. The thought forming in my head that this stranger was truly some fantastical creature in disguise, and therefore an authority on the authenticity of depictions of the fantastic. No amount of creativity, no amount of outside-the-box thinking could have allowed me to imagine what the man showed me. He smiled, unzipped his windbreaker, shook away the grisly debris, and placed it atop a shelf. He then held up his hands with his palms facing me, imitating that I should either stand back or prepare myself for something. I took a step back and tried to steel myself against the sight of something I couldn't have ever anticipated seeing. He then transformed. Not completely, only his torso and his head. The legs remained human, probably just because he hadn't wanted to remove his pants. The portions revealed to me were enough to carry his point, though. The head would have been enough. There was something simultaneously divine and yet obscene about the thing he partially morphed into. The overall morphology, if it had been completed, would have been utterly alien to the human form. The head collapsed in upon itself, and from that heap a new thing blossomed, though whether or not it served the same cephalic purposes I cannot say. The chest unraveled, the skin of it, that is, and several things burst forth. I'm hesitant to call them organs, because that suggests a purpose of physiological human function, and these projections, these buds, might have been simply naturally grown ornamentation or armor. It is impossible to apply human characteristics to this supernaturally inhuman individual. These chest growths were varied in color, and not even stagnant in their individual coloring. They glowed luminously, iridescently, like bioluminescent bulbs. The shoulders and arms extended, widened, and contorted, becoming wing-like appendages, though they also seemed to serve some sort of sensory purpose, which I judged by the way they gravitated towards me. The stomach bulged inordinately and then became transparent, revealing a dazzling microcosm of spectral life within. Some kind of photic pregnancy. The whole structure, to call it a body would be a pathetically human thing to do, was both nightmarish and regal, a blessedly appalling sight that simultaneously chilled and spiritually exonerated my soul. It was a beat-fic bastardization of what had once been or appeared to be a human body. When it spoke, I was seized and disheartened by an inestimably dreadful horror. No terrestrial entity, nothing born of the known elements within the mapped universe, could have produced that exocosmically abysmal sound. And yet beneath the awfulness of its abyss-deep tones, there was a paradoxically Empyrean timbre, as if within the blackly sonorous voice piped the trumpets of a heavenly choir. Stupidly, not really understanding anything beyond that I was less than nothing compared to this being, I asked, "Are you an angel?" The doubly intoned voice responded,
"I am no more an angel than you are, my friend. At my highest station, I am an intercessor, an entity through which you may convey your concerns and prayers. I kneel before the Prime Beings, as they kneel before the Prime Being."
With that, the stranger resumed his human appearance in a physical de-evolution and arc dissipation that was even more unsettling, because I knew what it had been, and it seemed almost perverse for the human body to contain something so wondrously terrifyingly grand. When his human body had fully reconstituted, the man put on his windbreaker and walked away. Mechanically, mind numb by the awesome showcase, I followed him. But by the time I exited the aisle, he had gone from the store. The store owner rose from a crouched position behind the register, presumably having cowered at the sound of the first gunshot. He looked at me funnily, and I remembered that I was covered in blood. I looked down, meaning to wipe away any substantial chunks of the gunman that had clung to my clothing, but instead I saw the bare front of my chest and stomach and other lower regions also exposed. On my shoes, instead of bloodstains, there were ashen smears. I turned and went back into the aisle, and instead of steaming human remains, I saw a scattering of ashes and scorched carpet. It took a moment for the realization of what had occurred to set in, but when it did, it brought back a fresh horror, and beneath that, a melancholy born of a recognition of my cosmic insignificance. The mere partial transformation into the sub-angelic being's true form had generated an immense heat, which had blasted to ashes the sundered corpse of the gunman and burnt away the front part of my clothing. The raw sheer power exuded by the entity was deeply humbling, and I shook uncontrollably as I returned to the store owner. I told him that I was going to the hospital and to direct the police there if they were not immediately contacted by the hospital staff due to the nature of my wounds. Half naked, skin singed, I walked away from the video store that I'd never returned to, because in only a moment, I had had my fill of the strange, of the fantastical, and of the horribly nightmarishly macabre.